It seems that throughout all of time, history has been a spark for endless debate. It could be debating whether some well known event actually occurred the way people think, what the causes of another event actually were, or what piece of land belongs to who. Whenever we have these debates, something of extreme importance is on the line: the truth. The truth often finds itself in danger from those who wish to be right at any and all cost. However, it is imperative that we embrace the truth wherever it is, and no matter how uncomfortable, because to embrace falsehoods in the name of agenda or comfort means more than just walking blindly through a forest, but leads down a dark path for us all. Welcome to Back Then and Back Again. I'm your host, Paskey, and today we are going to be going over a complicated topic: the Cleopatra race controversy. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this controversy is not so complicated because historians don't have a good idea or general consensus of what she looked like. What we do have, actually, is a good deal of evidence that points toward Cleopatra having the same olive skin tone and physical attributes of her Greek ancestors. Despite this, a more or less modern idea of racial identity and solidarity, which didn't even exist during Cleopatra's time, has complicated the conversation around her. The Black Cleopatra theory largely developed in the United States over the past 100 or so years, and it pushes back on the idea that she was white because she was the 8th generation descendant of her family in Egypt, and it posits that therefore she was most likely black. This controversy was recently brought back into the spotlight by the casting of a black actress as Cleopatra in Netflix's docuseries about the Egyptian queen. Now, what I will not be doing here is dunking on the Netflix series like so many other videos have done. As satisfying as those can sometimes be, I'm here to cultivate conversation and debate, and dunking only puts people on the defensive. Instead, we will be taking a look at the evidence which we have and the conclusions made by experts in the field in order to ascertain the correct answer to the Cleopatra race controversy. But before we get started on that, we really should address why this matters. The easiest answer to this question is Cleopatra's presence in our culture. Despite being the last in a long line of Cleopatras, she is the Cleopatra. She has been the subject of countless works of art over the 2,000 years since her death, and she has commanded attention in various forms of media, such as the 1963 film Cleopatra, HBO series Rome, and Assassin's Creed Origins. Each of these depictions agree on much. She was well educated, she used her sexuality for political gain, and that she was white. It's also worth noting here that HBO and Assassin's Creed's depictions fall closest to reality with their olive-tone depictions. The point is that we are utterly fascinated with her. The real Cleopatra was a strong, educated, determined leader who faced off against the giants of her day. Netflix's depiction constitutes more than a simple reimagining or reassessment of Cleopatra. It hits at a well-known character of history for what seem to be political means. That's not a blind accusation either, that's the director herself stating that. All that said, with our modern sensibilities, it is very tempting to think that Cleopatra's race should not matter. Let the best actress play the part, some may say. This is where we get to another reason why this matters: the issue with ascribing our perceptions of race onto a time when no such concept existed. Differences in skin color were noticed, sure, but they weren't how people identified with a group. Instead, most in Cleopatra's time derived their identities from their ethnikos, from which we get our modern concept of ethnicity. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the Greek ethnikos and what comprised it. Greeks shared the same blood, or held common descent to one another. They spoke the same language, or at least dialects of the same language. They practiced a shared religion, and they shared many of the same customs. Anyone who didn't share each of these were considered barbarians, and those foreigners that were able to speak Greek or perhaps adopted any other Greek practices were referred to as civilized barbarians. Let's focus on this idea of shared blood. The idea of shared blood is extremely important because it shows us that in order to belong to a particular ethnicity, or more accurately to hold citizenship in a particular society, you would need to maintain that bloodline connection. For example, Athenian colonists for centuries before Christ maintain their citizenship with the mother state by maintaining a direct blood connection to it. In Egypt, Cleopatra's family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, was extremely concerned with maintaining the purity of its Macedonian Greek pedigree. Therefore, the color of Cleopatra's skin would have been indicative of her ancestral origins. In a world where intrigue and murder were a constant threat between members of royal families, especially in Ptolemaic Egypt, a member of the family who looked as if the stork got confused and dropped the wrong baby off at the house would have been cause for great scandal within the royal family.
Hey, honey! Our baby's here! He looks just like your boss.
In fact, people of all races became respected and valued across the ancient world as tradesmen, warriors, scholars, and more. The color of a person's skin would simply provide a clue as to their origins. Greek and Roman accounts, for instance, speak with a great deal of respect for Ethiopian tradesmen in Egypt, Ethiopian being the Greco-Roman term for people with dark skin from sub-Saharan Africa. Returning to Egypt and the idea of ethnicity, concerted efforts were made to prevent the different ethnic populations of Egypt from mixing, thereby maintaining blood purity. Egypt under the Ptolemies was legally segregated. Greeks who occupied the position of first-class citizens in Egypt primarily confined themselves to the Greek-founded cities of Naucratis, Ptolemais, and the capital of Alexandria. Native Egyptians, on the other hand, held second-class status and were prevented from holding citizenship in these Greek cities. Intermarriage was also forbidden between ethnic groups, and different legal and taxation systems applied to each as well. As a result, significant tension developed between these groups and frequently broke out into open violence and even rebellion. All this said, where does the Black Cleopatra theory find its air to breathe? That's a great question, and in order to answer it, some point towards the questions in Cleopatra's family tree. Dr. Sally Ann Ashton, Dr. Shelley P. Haley, and Deborah Hurd, who are all featured scholars in the Netflix docuseries, accurately state that the identities of Cleopatra's mother and paternal grandmother are unknown. Speculations have been made that these unknown women may have been native Egyptians, and thereby passed on a dark skin tone to Cleopatra. However, there is evidence which we can use to give us a general clue as to who these mystery women may have been. First off, we need to understand that the suggestion that either woman was Egyptian is highly unlikely. For one, I'd like to remind you of the segregated society which the Ptolemies ruled over. Of course, it is possible that Ptolemy IX and Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's grandfather and father respectively, saw themselves as above these laws and the expectations for maintaining the purity of the bloodline. But, as mentioned before, the dynasty was rife with murderous plots for obtaining royal power. If one of these men had taken a second-class citizen for a wife and queen, said queen's legitimacy to rule would have been immediately called into question, and likewise the products of said union. Additionally, there is only one known Egyptian mistress throughout all of Ptolemaic history, and she belonged to the second Ptolemy, not the 9th or the 12th. This brings us to Cleopatra's father, who received the nickname the Illegitimate, a nickname we learned from Cicero, a Roman who lived at the same time as Ptolemy XII. The circumstances of Ptolemy XII's birth are complicated to say the least, as it occurred during or near the time when his father, Ptolemy IX, was challenged for the Egyptian throne and banished to Cyprus by his mother Cleopatra III and brother Ptolemy X. Theories for who Ptolemy XII's mother was go in two directions. First, that she was Cleopatra IV, Ptolemy IX's sister and first wife, who he was forced by his mother to divorce before he was exiled to Cyprus. The second theory is that she was an unknown Alexandrian Greek concubine. So how could Ptolemy XII be illegitimate if his mother were Cleopatra IV? Well, this is explained by the fact that she never reigned as co-regent, making any children of the union ineligible to inherit the throne. As for the concubine, it's obvious how a roll in the hay with the royal mistress would result in an illegitimate child.
It's got to be the king.
So to put it simply, the illegitimacy of Ptolemy XII was alleged most likely because of an ongoing royal controversy and the nature of his parents' marital status, rather than the specific identity of his mother. To inject logic into this further, it stands to reason that Ptolemy X would pull a Stannis Baratheon and question the legitimacy of his brother's children in order to strengthen his own claim. Now let's look at Cleopatra's own mother. Go ahead and imagine this. According to the Black Cleopatra theory, the man nicknamed the Illegitimate, whose rule over Egypt had been challenged at several points throughout his life by family or due to his own incompetence, would have had to marry a woman of second class status and then produce children who would therefore be of half second class blood. To state the obvious, this would have been an astounding moment of political stupidity. Yet there not only is no evidence of this, but Cleopatra's opponents throughout her life never accused her of having no legitimate claim to rule. To expand on the nature of many of the sources on Cleopatra, it's important to note that they were essentially propaganda against her. She made herself an enemy of Rome in particular, and most of the records on her that survive were written by Romans. Now, I will be releasing another video at some point, specifically addressing primary sources, but for now we will be content with the understanding that we should never take what they say at face value. This is because there is always some kind of bias, and the challenge is determining what that bias is so that we may understand what we can learn from it. Now, when looking at Cleopatra's detractors and what they wrote, we can rely upon their willingness to criticize her in any way they could. Like when Cassius Dio states that Cleopatra was of insatiable passion and insatiable avarice. She was swayed often by laudable ambition, but often by overweening effrontery. In other words, she was slutty, greedy, and preferred people of high arrogance and low morals. That said, it is particularly interesting when we realize that they make no mention of her being part barbarian, or otherwise any remark suggesting she had an appearance different from that which her family possessed. Think about it for a moment. If you had an enemy you wanted to see defeated and torn down from their pedestal, and you had some devastating dirt on them, would you keep their secret for them, or would you spill the beans? I'm thinking you might spill the beans. At this point, we've done a lot of talking about Cleopatra and what it would have meant if she looked different from the rest of her family. But what did the Ptolemies look like? Well, let's take a look at that. Over the 7 generations which preceded Cleopatra's birth, sources describe the members of the Ptolemaic dynasty as having either fair skin and occasionally blonde hair, or as being honey-skinned after the introduction of brides of Persian descent into the dynasty in the 3rd generation and 5th generation. The rest of the family tree are Greek marriages, and the chances of any further variation of physical characteristics was limited due to the fact that the Ptolemaic family tree is essentially a straight line in most places, or to put it plainly, they married brothers to sisters more often than not. Moving on, I want to state one more time that with the amount of rivalries for the throne within the dynasty and the purges and murders which occurred as a result, it would be absolutely fuel for scandal if a new member of the royal family looked drastically different from the rest. Finally, there is the claim in the docuseries that Cleopatra learned Egyptian and adopted Egyptian practices because she, quote, wanted to be remembered as Egyptian. It must be said that this is an outstanding presumption of intent. Ptolemaic kings and queens were well known for adopting aspects of Egyptian culture to legitimize their rule of the kingdom. This included their crowns, artistic portrayals, ceremonies, merging of Greek and Egyptian religions, the practice of marrying siblings, basically everything except the language for which they used translators. The argument that Cleopatra learned Egyptian and adopted some Egyptian practices because her mother was Egyptian herself would need to account for why none of her younger siblings spoke Egyptian, why there was no resistance amongst the Greek population to a half-Egyptian queen ruling over them, and why none of the rebellious native Egyptian population rallied behind even a rumor that an Egyptian had finally returned to the throne. As to the true identity of her mother, many historians agree that she was very likely Cleopatra V, as she disappears from palace records a few years after Cleopatra's birth. Furthermore, we need to ask ourselves what Cleopatra seeing herself as Egyptian means. Yes, the Ptolemaic dynasty adopted Egyptian practices in order to better assume control over the kingdom, but this doesn't constitute a total cultural shift within the family. In reality, Cleopatra and the rest of her family were brought up with a strong and thorough Greek education. This education was the pride of the ancient world and focused on the Greek traditions of oratory, philosophy, history, science, politics, and more. With that said, Cleopatra's impression of what Egyptian was came from a Greek point of view, and a royal Greek at that. So if we were to play devil's advocate here and go with Cleopatra desiring to be seen as Egyptian, then perhaps it's from the point of view of ruling Egypt and her battle to win sole ownership of its throne. So rather than Cleopatra wishing to be seen as an Egyptian queen, she demanded to be seen as the Egyptian queen. So if Cleopatra had the olive-toned skin common to Greeks and the Mediterranean at large, two questions come to mind. First, which we've already answered in part, is why does it matter? The second is, if so much of the scholarly community agrees that she likely had a light skin tone, why depict her as black? For the first question, let's add to our earlier answer by considering the wider implications of an incorrect depiction. Let's begin by recognizing the obvious truth that no one exists in a vacuum, nor has any person in history had a single experience which has not been influenced by another human being or their environment. If you depict a figure from history, you must depict their world as well. Depicting either inaccurately is doing an injustice by disregarding the full circumstances which surrounded their actions. To depict Cleopatra with dark skin, you either have to make the choice to wrestle with the reality of ethnic segregation in tiered legal systems which Cleopatra ruled over, while also identifying her with the people her government was oppressing, or you choose to ignore all that completely. Do you see why this is a massive problem? You can't mix and match with history, and you absolutely cannot decide what it should look like. When you do, you inevitably hit upon contradictions and complications with the story of the past you are trying to tell. It's important to remember that when we study the past, we aren't just looking at some abstract figures, but people who actually existed. They had very similar wants, needs, priorities, and lives to you and I. In order to best understand how we got to where we are today, we need to endeavor to see their world as near as possible to how they saw it. The past is there for us to learn from. If we see something in history that in our eyes isn't right or is just plain wrong, we need to continue our research to figure out how those circumstances came about and how they continue to develop over time. By understanding humanity's progress through history's chain of events, we give ourselves the power to change the one thing we can, the future. This reminds me of a well-known, if overused, saying with regard to history. If you don't learn it, you are doomed to repeat it. Although this is often used far too literally, it still holds some merit. The lesson we should take from it here is that the full context matters. We cannot change things that have happened just because it makes us feel more comfortable, nor can we ignore those things that make us uncomfortable. We can only grow as individuals and as a society when we take stock of the good and bad together, because you have to know where you've been in order to know where you can go, or else you might find yourself going backwards. And with that, that'll do it for today. We'll talk about the answer to the second question, if it's incorrect, why depict Cleopatra as black, in another video, since it would probably double the length of this one. So thanks for watching. If you liked what you heard, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't, thanks for sticking around to the end. Till next time,